Hello and welcome to part 4 of our video series on building a TypeScript and Postgres API. Today we're going to be taking a look at providing a config for our API, and we'll do that making use of a library that we installed earlier called .env. But before that, if you do want to follow along, there is a link in the video description to the GitHub repo that we're going to be using for this project. And if you head over there and you check out part 4, the branch part 4, then you'll have the code in front of you exactly the same as what I have here. So first and foremost, let's have a chat about how we provide configuration via environment variables. We have installed this package here called .env, and .env works by making use of a file at the root of our project, which is a .env file. And a .env file is used in a variety of technologies to provide configuration for an application, so that you can have multiple .env files for, say, a local developer environment, a preview, or a production environment. And all the config for your application is essentially then centrally managed with a single configuration file. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to wire up one of our environment variables that we're going to need, and that one is port. So the syntax for a .env file is you have the variable on the left that you want to use, and on the right hand side is a string representation of the value that you want to pass in as part of your configuration. And what will happen is during the runtime of our application, .env will pull these variables from this file and attach them to the process that is running. And a process would be something like when we run npm run dev. What actually happens in the background is a process is spun up to run our API server, and attached to that process is a set of environment variables, which I'll show you how we access. So first things first, we're going to wire up a config folder, and within the config folder, we're going to add an index.ts file, and this is going to contain all of our configuration code. And what we want to do is make sure that .env initializes and parses this .env file as quickly as we can within our application to make everything available. So we're going to import .env from .env. And then what we're going to do is we're going to call .env.config, which essentially instructs .env to go and look for this .env file at the root of our project and place everything within that file onto our process. Next up, we're going to declare an interface for our config. This is just a TypeScript definition for what our config will actually look like at the end of it. And what we're going to do is we're going to do port, and that's going to be a string. And then what we're going to do is we're going to export const config, which is going to be a config object. And on that, we're going to then declare port. And what .env is going to do is it's going to attach this port environment variable that we've got declared here onto process.env.port. So I'll actually apply this here. And what you'll find is process.env, any value that's attached to it is either going to be a string or undefined. So what we need to do is we also need to just provide an operator just to provide a default value in the event that port is actually undefined. So we'll actually have an empty string here. Don't worry about this too much at the moment, because we will provide some code to actually validate that the environment variables for our application are valid. What we're going to do next is we're going to declare an array of required environment variables for us to work with. So this will help our application understand which environment variables are required for the application to start properly. So let's do that now. We've got export if I could type export const required config keys, and that's going to be an array of keys from this config interface here. So what it means is that this particular array must contain keys that are part of this interface, right? So the first one that we're going to add on is going to be port. So that means that this array is just going to be an array at the moment just containing the word the word port. And next up, what we're going to do is then write a small function to actually validate that our environment variables contain the environment variables that we're expecting for our application to run correctly. So we'll just do export function validate config. And that's actually not going to return anything. It's just going to be a void function. And then what we'll do is we'll add a new variable called missing config values, which is going to be an array similar to this required config keys. It's just going to be an array of keys from this config interface. And then to begin with, it's going to be completely empty because we start off assuming that everything is available on our environment, and then what we'll do is we'll actually check those, and if they're not there, then we will include those values in our missing config values array. So what we're going to do is we're going to do for const required config key of required config keys. So this is going to iterate over this array of required values or required keys. And then what we're going to do, we're just going to check if no process.env required config key. Then we're actually going to push that config key into the array that's capturing which values are actually missing. So now that we've done that, what we can then do is we can then say if missing config values dot length is greater than 0, we want to throw new error, and we're going to want to throw an error that says missing required environment variables. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to join these missing config values with a comma and a space. So to go over what this function actually does, so first of all, we create an array that's going to capture any missing environment variables that we're expecting. Then we iterate over all of the environment variables that we are expecting to be available and check if they do exist. If they don't exist, then we capture the ones that don't exist and throw an error if there are any missing environment variables. It's really important to do this at the start of starting up your application, because what you don't want is your application to start up correctly and then only crash later on when it finds out that it doesn't have an environment variable that it's expecting. So to see this in action, what we can do is we can take this validate config function that we declared here, and we can import it into our application right at the very top, because we want it to run before anything happens, before the API server starts or anything. So we're just going to import it here, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to replace this port value since we actually no longer need it. Actually, what we'll do is we'll just do port equals config dot port. So what this is going to do is it's no longer going to be a statically defined variable. It's actually going to pull it from our environment variable file. Now, what should happen when we start our application server? Because that environment variable is in our .env file, everything will start correctly. So we'll get API server listening on port 3000. If we put in, say, 8080, we'll notice that API server started on port 8080, but if it's missing entirely, considering it's a required environment variable, when we run our application now, we'll get a nice message that says missing required environment variable, and it's going to have port, and if we have additional environment variables in the future, it's going to show those as well. So that's how we provide this configuration, and that's how we provide it via environment variables. What we're going to do now is just write up some quick unit tests just to validate the functionality that we've written, because when we do npm run unit test at the moment, what we'll find is all of our tests pass, but we actually have a bunch of lines that are not covered within our application. So in order to cover those off, what we're going to do is write unit tests for our config file. So we'll add an index.unit.test.ts. What we're going to do first and foremost is we are going to mock out .env because we don't actually want it to do anything for us. And then what we're going to do is before each test within this file, we're actually going to call this function called jest.reset modules. Now what this will actually do is this will reset any required modules within your test files back to their original state. It'll become clear why we need to do this shortly as we begin writing our tests, but what will happen essentially is we will begin testing bits of functionality such as what happens when port isn't defined on the process.env. Does it come back with a default value? What happens when validate config runs without a value? And we'll run a bunch of assertions on those test cases as well. So what we're going to do, we'll start off by writing some tests for our config. So we'll do a describe block config. And then what we're going to want to do, we'll want to write a nice test case which says it picks up values, config values from process.env. So this test is actually going to assert that if we provide a port value, that port value ends up on this config object at the end of it. So let's do this. So we'll first of all capture the current process env as a temporary variable so that we can reset it at the end. We'll create a new process environment, and then we'll pass in port 3000. So this is going to provide an actual value for it. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to require the config variable at a precise moment in time. And the reason that we need to do it like this, as opposed to importing config at the top of the file, so if we did import config from the index here, what actually happens is this config variable gets evaluated right at the top of your file, so it will actually run before anything else within our test file runs, before we overwrite the process variable, and it just won't work as expected. So what this does here is it actually says only import or require this config variable on this line of the code. That way we can do all of our setup for our tests just before it. So what we can then do is we can actually then just write a nice assertion that says expect config dot to equal, and then we're going to write port 3000, because what we're actually expecting is because we've defined it on here, that it's actually going to end up in the config variable config object as that defined value. And then what we'll do is we'll just do process.env equals process.env. So we'll actually reset the process environment at the end. So let's run our unit tests and see how we get on there. So we'll find that we now have a test that passes. So it picks up the config variables there, which is nice. We're missing some test coverage on lines 22 and 27. So that is this piece here and this piece here. So we've actually got some missing validation. So we'll actually come along to writing some validation, validate config unit tests shortly. But what we also want to do is we also want to write some sensible tests to check for different cases. So in this situation, what we want is it picks up default config values when items are not found on process.env. So what we'll do is we'll just make our process.env a completely empty object so that there is no port on it. And the default behavior that we're expecting for this particular one is it will end up just as an empty string. So we'll just remove that one there, run our unit test again, and we've now got an additional passing test. Now, what I mentioned earlier on in the series is that it can be quite easy to get 100% test coverage, but still have tests that aren't very good. And this is a prime example of it, right? So our test coverage does not say that we're necessarily missing coverage for these particular lines at the moment. But what we've done here is we've taken time to write tests that go above and beyond and actually test both the success and failure cases, such as when things are provided or aren't provided. So we've gone a step above just writing the very basic unit tests and are actually trying to write tests that will capture a variety of scenarios. So all that's left for us to do now is actually to provide, to run some tests for the validate config function. So let's do this, describe validate config. And then what we'll do is we actually just want to test for it throws an error if required environment variables are missing. So we actually want to test that, if those variables are actually missing, we want to ensure that the test or the piece of code actually throws an error. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the required config variables and the validate config function, and then we'll do a const. We'll import those two functions just when we need them, similar to the config above. So we'll do that with a require a dot. And then what we'll do is we will reset the environment. We will set the environment to be an empty object. And then what we'll do is when you're testing for functions that throw an error, it's important when you're writing your expect argument for that function that you use an anonymous arrow function to actually call your function. Otherwise, it actually won't call it correctly, and you'll end up with odd results. So when we're testing for our function to actually throw an error, we'll write it with an anonymous function beforehand just to invoke the validate config. And Jest has this really nice assertion here that says we're expecting this to throw, and then we can do new error. And actually, because we've imported these variables from here, we can actually just go in and grab this error from here, and we've got let's just remove that throw, and we've got this one here. So these are the required variables that we're expecting, and we're expecting the error that's thrown to contain every required variable because we've got none of them defined here. And then finally what we'll do is we'll just reset the environment back to what it was before. So let's run those unit tests again now. And what we've got is a full set of unit tests for our configuration setup. Now, what these unit tests are actually going to be helpful for is capturing any changes, that we are not necessarily expected. So let's say somebody comes along and changes this particular file here. Our unit tests will now actually fail because that underlying implementation has changed. And now this is a really good place to actually review what you've changed. And if it is a required change, then you can actually just come in here and update the test file as well. But often what it will do is it will capture when things have changed that are kind of unexpected, and that's what these unit tests are really good for. So when you have another developer coming along and writing code for your code base, when they run the unit tests, it's really obvious if they've broken something with any change that they've made. So that's all set up. We've got our config being validated, and we've got some helper functions, some interfaces for our application to use, and we've made our application use this new config environment variable. So that's all working as expected. I hope the video's been helpful, and I will see you in the next one.